Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in the summer, the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself.
The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Miss Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and all saw she didn't know it. Was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love? He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation. The one looking down from above, the other looking up, but that was as far as it even went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but Mr. Hoppy, it seemed like a million miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of a tea biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, this courage failed him. As I said, he was very, very shy man. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else, and that somebody was a smart tortoise called Alfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Plants had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without tumbling over the edge. And in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie would crawl every night to keep warm when the colder weather came along in November. Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the turtle would crawl in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie feels the warm weather through his smell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house into
the balcony, and Miss Silver would clap her hands in joy and cry without welcome back, my darling one. How I missed you. It was at the time like this that Mr. Hop wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a turtle. Now we come to certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely, she was saying, and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery. Good morning, Mrs. Silver. Mr. Hoppy said, Alfie's looking well this morning. Isn't he gorgeous? Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. Absolutely gorgeous, Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Miss Silver's smiling face, gazing up into his own, he thought for the 1000th time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. I do so wish he would grow a little faster, Mrs. Silver was saying every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep. I weigh him on the kitchen scales, and do you know that in all the 11 years I had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing. What does he weigh now? Mr. Hoppy asked her. Just 3 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered, about as much as a grapefruit. Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy said slowly, but they can live for 100 years. I know that, Mrs. Silver said, but I do so wish he would grow just a little bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow. He seems just fine as he is, Mr. Hoppy said. No, he's not just fine. Mrs. Silver cried. Try. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you? Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea came rushing out of his head. Of course I would, Mrs. Silver cried. I'll give anything to make it happen. I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are huge. People can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Mr. Hoppy's mind went springing like a fly wheel. Here suddenly went his big change. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quick. Mrs. Silver, he had I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises go faster. That's really what you want. You do? She cried. Oh, please tell me. I'm feeding him the wrong thing. I'd work in the North African once. Mr. Hoppy said, that's where all those tortoises in England come from. And a tribesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you, tell me. Mr. Hoppy said, I'll be your slave. When he heard the words, your slave for life, it's Mr. Hoppy. I'm going to start. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you, tell me. Mrs. Hoppy, I'll be your slave for life. Mr. Hoppy. When he heard the words, your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you.
In a couple of minutes, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. I'm going to lower it to you on a bit of string, he said, or it might blow away. Here it comes. Mrs. Sylvie caught the paper and held it up in front of her. This is what she read. Esio Trot, Treg, Regiem, Emoko no Esio Trot, Rangpu, Brafpu, Tutspu, Grimpu, Orpu, Lespu, Grog, Elezug, Boots, Plug, Drop, No Tap, Eso Trap, Tap, No Tap, Tag, No Tag, I will drop. What does it mean? She asked. Is it another language? It's Troy's language, Mr. Hoppy said. Troys are very backwards creatures. They can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it? I suppose so, Mr. Silver said, be wary. Esio Trot is simplified Trot spelled backwards. Mr. Hoppy said, look at it. Mrs. Silver said, the other words are spelled backwards too. Mr. Hoppy said, if you turn them around to humans' language, they simplify, say, Troy, get bigger, come on, Troits, grow up, puff up, suit up, spring up, blow up, smell up, garage, grizzle, stuff up, go, put on fat, Troits, put on fat, get on, gobble food. Mrs. Silver exclaimed the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, Lucy said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with tortoise. Now what you have to do, Mr. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and at night. Let me hear you practice them, very slowly, and stumbling a little over the strange words. Mr. Silver read the whole message out loud in tortoise language. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expression into it. When you say it to Alfie, if you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mr. Silver said. I'll try anything, of course. I will, but I can't believe it will work. You wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her.
Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. You're safe for life, he kept repeating to himself, breathless. But there was a lot of work to be done before that. Only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it all over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoise. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them carefully. To you and me, there's not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in their color of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all short and different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces. Others a great deal more, but he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owners told him. That's all they need, and a bowl of water. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets of 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all. But it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room has been. They were all in there together. The floor was swarming with turtles of different sizes, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Hoppy, and to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that, he must get on with the job. Before he returned, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus grade, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he could use his old Ben for an hour or two. What he had to do was to make something that would reach from his own balcony to Miss Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not very difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube and ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to a metal claw in such a way that when you pull the wires, the claw close. When you push them, the claws open. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Miss Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Miss Hoppy. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Miss Severs had gone to work, Miss Hoppy went out onto his balcony. On with his long metal pole. He called this his toy catcher. He landed over the balcony, released and lowered the pole down onto Miss Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Miss Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above a file. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered
that two claws nearly over a file shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tiny over the snail like two fingers of a hen. He holded a file up onto his own back wing. It was easy.
Poppy waved Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 3 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of toys to find one that, first of all, had the same color shell as Alfie's, and second of all, weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It was less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it.
From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he couldn't hardly tell that one was bigger than the other, but it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws onto the tortoise's catcher. Then he jored it onto Mr. Silver's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce leaf. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick, old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce, started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mr. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment.
Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out. "Mummy, back, have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chopping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy. Magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper. Esio Trot, Deg Regib, Emok no Esoi Trot, Rog Bu Fub Bu Tu Pu Gibs Bu Wolb Bu Les Bu Egrog Elsug Fruits Plug Duf Notaf Esoi Trot Tup Notaf Teg Noteg Egbag Og Duf. Hoppy hopped his head out of the sludge and called out, "Good evening, Miss Silver. How is Elsie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mr. Silver said, looking up and beaming. "And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words you'll never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You'll never know." Mr. Hoppy wanted 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mr. Silver wasn't at work, he slipped tortoise number 2 to the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 13 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces. 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17 ounces tortoise, and once again he made sure that the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mr. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it was growing at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. Is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of the third week, tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. End of fifth week, tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. End of sixth week, tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. End of seventh week, Tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. Alpha's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver Pet had more than double in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Miss Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually.
But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mr. Silver that he out to wake Alpha when a started crying from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look, Mr. Silver," was shouting. Alpha's too big to get out of the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously. "Wait him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and wait him quick." Mr. Silver did just that, and in a half a minute he was back holding the turtle in both hands and waving it above his head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy, guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He weighs as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," he cried, starting the turtle. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look what that clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you."
Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Miss Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Miss Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand? He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Miss Silver cried. "You're a miracle man, you are indeed. But what am I going to do about his house?" Miss Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Miss Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the
magic words instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller, but in total language. Of course, will that work? Of course it will work. Tell me Actually, that's what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy. Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, Esio Trot, Esio Trot, take a tip Williams, a tip Williams, that do it, Mr. Silver, he says, handing her that paper. I don't mind trying it, Mr. Silver said, but look her, I showed and him to get till she small all over again, Mr. Hoppy, he want dear Landy, he want Mr. Hoppy said, say it only tonight and tomorrow. Mom, and mom morning, and then see that happens. We missed me. Lucky it if it works, Mr. Silver says, touching his softly on the arm. Then you are the best man alive.
The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It would. He chose another again. He tested it. This one went too nicely. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce that went inside the wait. Mrs. Silver homecoming. That evening Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver shout from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, Mr. Hoppy, where are you? She was shouting. Just look at this. Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, what's up? Oh, Mr. Hoppy, they worked, she was crying. Your magic words have worked on against Afra. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle. Can I come down and look? Mr. Hoppy shouted back. Come down at once, my dear man, Miss Silver answered. Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Ethel. Mr. Hoppy turned around
from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoeing like a ballet dancer between the sea of horses that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew downstairs, two at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I must bish it, I must bosh it. I must keep very calm." When he was 3/4 way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You really are the most wonderful man I ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlor, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him.
That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Miss Silver, please will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoopy," she cried, "I didn't think you'd ever get around to ask me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoopy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Miss Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hoopy said, "we'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoopy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tomato.
A few weeks later, Miss Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after.
I expect you are wondering what happened to little Alfie. The first of them all, well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squid, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato sauce and crispy celery. And in the winter he hibernated in a box of dry leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still the much-loved family pet. And Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow the 2 twice the size he was when Mr. Silver had him, but he made it in the end.